Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where we take your sources, sift through them, and really try to pull out the key insights on some, well, pretty complex topics. Today, we're jumping into something profound and, let's be honest, often confusing. God's punishment and discipline, particularly from a biblical angle. You sent us a great mix of material theological articles, online debates, lots of people grappling with tough questions. So our goal today, we want to clarify the biblical distinctions, between punishment and discipline, look at some examples of what people call divine retribution, and really unpack those challenging questions about a loving God and, well, suffering or judgment.
Yeah, it's a big one. Believers, non-believers, people have wrestled with this for centuries. And what's really interesting, I think, is seeing the different interpretations pop up when you examine the scriptures. We'll be leaning heavily on sources like Thomas McDaniel's piece, A Biblical Look at God's Punishment and Discipline. Also, Rudolf Boshoff's work on God's role in suffering. That's kind of his theodicy model.
Theodicy, right? That's the attempt to square God's goodness with evil and suffering existing.
Exactly. And we've also got the Topical Bible, Divine Punishment Entry, and even a really lively Reddit discussion from Irreligion. The title sums it up. How do you justify the divine retribution towards innocent people?
Okay, quite a mix. Let's get into it and see what the sources tell us. So Thomas McDaniel's article dives right into a huge question. Does God punish us or does he discipline us? I think a lot of us have felt, maybe God was mad at us or we were getting some kind of wrath. What's the core difference the sources draw here?
Well, McDaniels puts it pretty starkly. He says the scripture is clear God disciplines and does not punish. That's a big statement. He really emphasizes that for Christians, for those who accept Christ, the actual punishment for sin isn't dealt out by God the Father. Why? Because Jesus took it. That's Romans 8.1.
Okay, so Jesus took the punishment. That's fundamental. But then bad things still happen to believers. So if it's not punishment, what is it? What's God doing then?
Right, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And McDaniel says that's discipline. He quotes Hebrews 12.11, saying discipline is for training. It's not fun, but makes us think twice, and ultimately yields the peaceable fruit of righteousness.
Training. Okay. So it sounds tough, yeah, but ultimately good for us. Can you give us maybe an analogy for how that works?
Sure. Think of a loving parent or maybe a good coach. Hebrews 12.6 says, "For the Lord disciplines the one he loves and chastises every son whom he receives." And Proverbs 13.24, the spare the rod curse, it says, "Whoever spares the rod hates his son, but he who loves him is diligent to discipline him." The implication is, this discipline is love. It's meant to correct, to prevent future issues, not just to inflict pain for past wrongs.
So punishment is about retribution, paying back for the wrong.
Yeah.
But discipline is about changing the heart, rehabilitation.
Exactly. Godly correction, that's the aim.
That distinction feels really, really important. But what about just stuff happening? Natural consequences. Does McDaniels talk about that too? Because sometimes bad choices just lead to bad outcomes, right?
Yeah, he does clarify that. He says, consequences are not God's punishment. They are the natural results of wrongful actions. So his example is, God can forgive someone for murder, absolutely. But that doesn't mean the person won't face legal consequences, like jail time. It means God holds people accountable, yes, but for believers, the punishment aspect was dealt with by Jesus. What remains is discipline for correction and, well, the natural fallout from our choices.
Okay, that framework helps. Discipline, not punishment, for believers, plus natural consequences. But now we have to tackle those really difficult Bible stories, the ones that look a lot like punishment, even divine retribution.
And this is where it gets complex and frankly uncomfortable for many. The Topical Bible source defines divine punishment straight up as retributive justice executed by God in response to human sin and disobedience. And it lists the big ones from the Old Testament: the fall, the flood, Sodom and Gomorrah, the Egyptian plagues, the Israelites wandering in the wilderness.
Yeah, those are definitely tough.
And in the New Testament, too, things like Ananias and Sapphira dropping dead in Acts, or King Herod's rather gruesome end. Boshoff also mentions Job's suffering, the conquest of Canaan, David's punishment, even Christ's crucifixion, which seems incredibly unjust, but brought salvation.
Okay, and this is exactly where the questions from that Reddit thread come roaring in, right? How do you justify the divine retribution towards innocent people? Because in things like the flood or Sodom, it wasn't just the supposedly guilty who suffered. You had children, maybe others not directly involved. How can make just God do that?
That's the crux of the issue for many people, and the sources, especially Boshoff, lay out several ways Christians have tried to understand these events. It's not always one single answer. He mentions things like seeing it as straightforward divine judgment on sin, or maybe as moral education, like tests of faith.
Okay.
Then there's considering the cultural and historical context. Maybe these accounts reflect the understanding of that time, or acknowledging the mystery and incomprehensibility of God. His ways aren't our ways.
Isaiah 55:9, yeah.
Right.
Also, the consequences of human free will, maybe God allows choices to play out, even tragically. Some suggest these could be literary or rhetorical devices, maybe exaggerated language for effect. And finally, the idea of progressive revelation, that our understanding of God deepens over time.
A lot of different lenses to view these through. In that Reddit discussion, one user, Owl0, had a specific take on Noah's flood in Sodom. What was their argument?
They argue that the people destroyed were truly the worst, incredibly arrogant, even challenging God's prophet to bring punishment. They suggested the good people listened to the prophets, like Noah or Lot, and were saved. And controversially, perhaps, they suggested that even the innocent children who died were actually saved from corruption and went straight to heaven. So, a kind of tragic mercy in their view.
That's one interpretation. But another user, Lirality, offered a really different take on Sodom, challenging the common view of its sin. Yes, that was fascinating. They pointed to Ezekiel chapter 16 and also the Talmud, arguing that Sodom's real sin wasn't primarily sexual, but things like arrogance, neglecting the poor, greed, cruelty, injustice, a whole societal breakdown.
So not just one thing, but a complete societal corruption.
Exactly. And their interpretation suggested the judgment was maybe aimed more at a corrupt ruling class, and that the poor or oppressed might have already died or been driven out by that system before the final destruction. It really emphasizes digging deeper than just the surface reading.
But even with these interpretations, that core tension remains, doesn't it? How can a just God allow or even cause suffering for those who seem innocent? Like the children. Another Reddit user, JustWhyMan, really pushed back on the saved by drowning idea.
Yes, they called it illogical and basically asked, why couldn't God just target the specific evil people? Why the widespread destruction?
That hits hard. It feels like our human sense of fairness just clashes with these accounts sometimes.
It absolutely does. And this is where Boshoff brings in the concept of God's sovereignty, the idea that God is ultimately in control, even while allowing human freedom, and that somehow, maybe in ways we don't see, he works things for good, like Romans 8:28 says, for those who love him. No. But as Boshoff acknowledges, that theological concept doesn't just erase the difficulty for our human understanding. The clash between human morality and these divine actions is, well, it's a real point of struggle in these discussions.
Yeah, okay. We've unpacked the discipline versus punishment distinction for believers. We've looked at these incredibly tough Old Testament narratives and the different ways people try to make sense of them. Where does this leave us? What's the takeaway trying to navigate all this?
Well, connecting it back, Boshoff really stresses the foundational Christian belief. God is love, good, just, merciful, and sovereign, all at once. He concludes essentially that God knows what he's doing, and some things might just not make sense to us this side of eternity. But trusting God means believing he has good reasons, even when we can't see them. It points towards faith, when reason hits a wall.
A reliance on faith. But the Reddit thread also brought up other perspectives, didn't it? More critical ones.
Right.
Like the user 6 Prince of Darkness Guy 9.
Right. They suggested maybe some stories aren't literal divine acts at all, but rationalizations by ancient people after, say, a natural disaster, trying to find meaning or control in chaos. Or maybe, they suggested, the morality of God in these texts actually just reflects the morality of the human authors writing the texts in their specific time and place.
That's a very different angle, looking at it more historically or anthropologically rather than theologically.
Exactly. And it raises that big question. How do we handle these vastly different ways of reading the same text? Some are faith-based interpretations, others are secular critiques. What the sources really show us, I think, is that there isn't one easy answer that satisfies everyone. Understanding these texts, especially about God and suffering, seems to require wrestling with different layers: context, theology, personal faith, critical thinking. It's not simple.
Wow, okay. That was definitely a deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground, the difference between God's discipline and punishment for believers, those really challenging biblical stories of divine retribution, and the wide range of perspectives trying to make sense of it all.
Yeah, from theological explanations trying to uphold God's justice and love to more critical views questioning the narratives themselves.
It's clear it's not just about what the Bible says happened, but maybe more about why it matters to us now and how we interpret it.
The sources seem to encourage holding on to God's overall character, described as loving, and just even when specific events feel confusing or, frankly, disturbing to our modern minds, it might be beyond our full grasp.
So for you, listening, perhaps the key takeaway is approaching these big questions with, like McDaniel said, a teachable spirit. But also, as the Reddit discussion showed, with critical thinking. It's okay to wrestle with it. Recognize the layers, the different lenses you can use to view these ancient, powerful texts.
And maybe think about this as you continue your own reflections. If we take that idea seriously, that divine discipline, if you believe in it, is meant as a sign of love, for refinement, how can maybe facing the hard stuff in your own life, regardless of where you think it comes from, potentially lead toward that peaceable fruit of righteousness Hebrews talks about?
That is definitely something powerful to chew on. We really hope this deep dive has given you a richer, maybe more nuanced way to think about these incredibly complex and important ideas.